morning once again. I'm Angelo, coming from the Netherlands. So I'm finishing my PhD studying innovation in the pharmaceutical industry. But before I started my PhD, I was working in the laboratory. So I was a chemist. And really, I enjoyed doing science. I liked the idea that I'll be the first person to find something new about how nature works. But then I realized this was not really my main passion. I was more interested, not in the science, but on how science impacts society. How can it change the world? Instead of the science itself, I'm more interested of scientists. What are their processes? What are their systems? How do they actually do their science? So I was really fortunate to do something that I was really passionate about. So for my PhD, I was part of this consortium by the EU. It's called FragNet. And I was working with natural scientists from different fields. But the funny part is, I was not working in the laboratory. I was approaching this new field called fragment-based drug discovery from a different approach altogether. So I was looking at it at the business and innovation side. But then, as you can imagine, there's a different mindset of like being a scientist, so working in the laboratory, and actually doing academic innovation research. So when I first started doing my literature review, it was kind of a labyrinth. It was super difficult for me to navigate. So for today, that's what I wanted to share with you, how I was able to navigate this literature, to give you an overview of what innovation scholars are studying when they look at the pharmaceutical industry. And at the same time, if you're not familiar with it, I would like to introduce to you to the magic of bibliometric methods. So if you're entering a new field, or if you want to do academic research in a totally new field altogether, then this is a perfect way to start your journey there. So what is bibliometrics? So as you may know, like every year, hundreds to thousands of papers, maybe even the millions, are published. And like if you're gonna read each one of them, it might take you forever, right? So what then the smart people did was develop statistical methods to analyze and get an overview of this literature easily. So in my case, I was looking at innovation journals. I was looking at the top journals in management, so that's like research policy, academy of management, and even those related specifically to technology management, such as Technovation. And when I look at the papers studying the pharmaceutical industry, I was able to find around 700 papers there. And as I told you, you can imagine if I read through all of that, it will take me basically the entire of my PhD to like understand which order do I read them, what system do I have in place in order to like really digest it efficiently. So then what we can do is use these bibliometric methods. So extract from these articles their textual data and also their citation data. If we combine that, then we can get an overview of the different themes, what are the trends in this literature. So that's what I'm going to share then. So I told you there's increasing interest among innovation scholars to looking at the pharmaceutical industry. So I told you around 700 articles. And then what you can do then from all of this is have this visualization. I know it's quite complex, but basically each of these circles corresponds to a paper, which we then label by one of the authors, the first author's last name, and also the year of publication. The size of the circle indicates the number of citations it has received from this literature. So you can say that like the bigger circle, probably the more important it is to this literature. And then the idea is like the closer they are to one another, the more related the papers are. We can then cluster these papers, and if we do that clustering, we can come up with these three different colors that we have here. And I have to say, it was just really a joy, like just going through, okay, what is this paper talking about? What does this paper talk about? And trying to get an overview of the themes or the trends in each of these clusters. And by doing that, by scanning through them and looking at their abstracts, we were able to label them as macro, meso, and micro. But what do this mean? So macro, this refers to studies that look at the large-scale factors that affect the industry. The cool thing with bibliometric methods is that you can also extract what are the important keywords for each of these clusters. So we find here words like patent, policy, market. So like I told you, like large-scale factors that affect the industry. Then we can go also to the meso level, which looks at the different relationships between different firms. So you can see here the words like collaborate, open innovation, probably. And then the biggest cluster among all of our studies look at the micro level. So looking at the firm itself, what are the different strategies, processes they do in order to develop new drugs. But again, still, it's still quite abstract, right? So what we can do then is look at the topics within these different clusters. So we can then apply the same clustering algorithm, but now on a more granular level. So if we do that, now from just 3 clusters, we can come up with 9 different clusters, and this corresponds to topics within these original clusters. So again, I talked to you about this, the macro, meso, micro, and we were able to identify different topics within them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it then. So if you're a practitioner in the field, I'd like you also to take time to also reflect on how these different factors affect your own practice, your own research. And if you're somebody who's studying business, maybe it's also time to reflect to if like which topic really interests you. What do you want to further explore if you're doing your thesis or you're planning to do a PhD afterwards. So at the top, we find the large-scale, I told you, macro-level topics, knowledge transfer, and innovation system. Knowledge transfer refers basically to the role of public research. So basic research performed by universities and publicly funded research institutes, and how this knowledge transfers to industry for them to develop their own medicines or treatments. Then we have innovation system, which looks at the institutions that make it possible for innovation to be created and also diffuse. So this normally talks about the role of policy, the role of government in stimulating innovation in the pharmaceutical industry. And then we can then move on at the meso level. And again, as I talked about before, it's about the different relationships or interactions within, across the firms in the pharmaceutical industry. So at the top, we have here the topic of collaborate networks, which uses network analysis to map the different interactions between the firms and then try to get the underlying structure that connects the firms with one another or different organizations. We can also look at the collaborations themselves. So that's the topic of strategic alliances, which tries to then understand what are the different success factors, what do firms actually gain from engaging in such collaborations or alliances. Then we can also assess these different collaborations from the point of view of the firms engaging in them. So on one hand, we have this term open innovation, which you've probably heard already. One way or another. So open innovation refers to the idea that innovation doesn't have to occur only within the boundaries of the firm. It can also occur at the interface, and then firms then have to have different processes, capabilities in order to cope with these challenges of like collaborating with different institutes, with academia, for instance, with bigger companies. And in contrast to the other meso level topics, there's also the topic of resources and capabilities, which now looks at how firms replenish their knowledge base by actually engaging in this. So as you may imagine, if you're a firm, you're not only collaborating, but you're also trying to compete with the firms that you're collaborating with sometimes. So then you have to then have this balance between this tension of like collaborating, but also at the same time trying to differentiate yourself from the different firms. Then we can then look at the firm level. On one hand, we have here organizational learning. So once knowledge is within your firm, how do you make sure that this is actually utilized so that it's used in order to develop new drugs, for instance? Strategic groups, this is kind of an old topic, which tries to divide the industry into different groups and how do these different groups differ in the strategies that they use. And finally, the biggest topic among all the papers that we analyze, it's product development. which kind of obvious. It looks at the drug discovery and development process itself and tries to find ways in order to manage it and also to increase the efficiencies of this topic. So this is the kind of the most technical topic among all of these management topics that we found, or innovation topics that we found. The next step then, we wanted to see, so among all these different topics, what is the trendiest? What are innovation scholars actually studying now? So we can just label them by the median year of publication. So the green is the one that is most recent. And as we can see here, the greenest ones are in the middle, so at the meso level, meaning innovation scholars are more and more interested in exploring how different companies collaborate with one another, basically. So not favoring anymore the previous topics such as the macro and the micro. But then we wanted to see, so what impact do these innovation researchers are doing to the industry itself? Right? Are they just in the clouds and not having any impact at all? So we then looked at how these innovation journals are being cited by pharmaceutical journals. So this is like a proxy of their impact to practitioners somehow. So we found around 200 articles that cite these original 700 articles on the innovation journals. We can do the same kind of analysis with them and label the different clusters that we find. But in this case, we don't really have enough time to go through each one of them. But for now, what I wanted to focus on is then tracking how do these different articles in the practitioner journals cite the articles from the innovation journals. So these lines here indicate the number of times that they were cited in those practitioner journals. So this was expected that the most cited one is product development, because I told you this was the most technical one, so obviously this is the most relevant to practitioners. At the same time, we have the macro level factors. Normally, this talk about neglected diseases, orphan diseases. So this is kind of relevant to practitioners. So we get a lot of citations also from that. But funny enough, I was talking to you before, right, that the most trendy one was in the meso level, so the collaborations, the alliances. But then for practitioner journals, they are not really citing this too much. So it means then that there's there needs then to be like better engagement between the innovation scholars and practitioners on what's really interesting for them and what's really relevant. So I hope that this research, through the research, you show that innovation scholars can benefit by looking at what interests practitioners. And also at the same time, practitioners can also benefit by engaging more, letting social scientists, innovation scholars pick into their black box so that they are carrying out research that would be also impactful for them. So thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward also to hearing from you on what your interests are. Thank you.